was the Philippines. That same storm had recorded also the lowest temperature record for a cloud top ever recorded on the Earth in the month of November in the Philippines, in the same exact area, almost the same exact trajectory of a typhoon. This one sets another record. Strongest typhoon ever recorded for April, ever in the history of recording typhoons. This goes back some 700 years. Although wind speeds were not so accurate as the Chinese were measuring along the coast 700 years ago, yet they had the tracks of all the typhoons and how many there were, the intensities of an entire village getting wiped away or only half a village getting wiped away. This was the way they determined wind speeds back then. But looking at 173 miles per hour, it's since dissipated, but it did reach that strongest typhoon on record for April. What's changing in our atmosphere?
But of all the consequences, one of the most noticeable is probably wildfires. Since the 80s, the devastating environmental phenomenon has become even more dangerous in pretty much every metric you can think of. Evidence has shown that around the world, over the last 4 decades, they've come to occur 5 times as often, affect 6 times the land area, and burn 5 times longer. While this is happening across the globe, it's most famously occurring in California. In the last decade, the state has faced 7 of its 10 worst wildfires ever. According to a 2018 study in the journal Earth's Future, trends like this can be attributed to increased temperatures as a result of climate change, since drier soils are more vulnerable to fire. If this trend isn't curbed, it's possible that all of California's forests burn down and make way for plains and grassland by the end of the century. The only way to solve it is to, stop climate change.
CO2 levels, which would have been caused by the seas releasing CO2 after the initial warming of the Earth. And once this rise did happen, CO2 levels are what led the Earth's temperature increase. Temperature and CO2 levels do seem to be completely related. One has almost always affected the other. So this is probably why scientists are getting their knickers in a bit of a twist. If we look back 800,000 years, we see the Earth's CO2 concentration hasn't ever really made it above 300 ppm. ppm just being a measure of concentration of CO2. But in just the last 100 years, CO2 levels have increased to over 400 ppm, meaning the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere is now 33% higher than we've ever known it to be in the last 800,000 years. Shortly after this CO2 increase, we've also seen a temperature rise on Earth of around 1.1 Celsius that has happened 5 to 10 times faster than almost any other global temperature rise we've ever measured. This change to our temperature is happening even though we are tilting away from the sun, and the amount of solar energy hitting the Earth each year is steadily reducing.
Severe flooding across Pakistan meant that the lives of more than 20 million people were affected. But it also had a consequence for the wildlife in the region, and some began behaving very strangely. Hundreds of millions of spiders had no choice but to climb up trees to escape the rising waters, and it took so long for them to recede that the spiders began to build their webs in their new surroundings. This led to the startling sight of trees being completely surrounded by a thick tangle of webbing, almost like something you'd expect to see on an alien world rather than here. If the thought of so many arachnids swarming all over the trees is too much to handle, there was a positive side effect of this phenomenon too. In the areas where it happened, far fewer cases of malaria were being reported than would be expected, especially with all the stagnant water, which would suggest that the mosquitoes were falling victim to these giant traps.
Because now we have hailstorm blanketing Saudi Arabia. Ha'il. This was grapul, the mix between snow and hail, and then some other areas were pure hail. Some of it was borderline snow, but the grapal or grapule, however you like to say it in the French or the English, was a predominant amount of this storm. The strangest thing was the temperature was 28 degrees Celsius, which is almost 90 Fahrenheit when this storm occurred. So again, atmospheric disturbances, interruptions, incredibly high cold dropping right through and making those microcells of cold where this type of grapule or ice made it down through 90-degree Fahrenheit temperatures and hit. And not only was the sand at least 90 degrees, it hit and cooled the entire sand layer enough for it to accumulate, which is strange in itself. How much really fell? What you're seeing is not the full amount of fall and accumulation, because that melted quite a bit to cool the temperature of the surface of the sand before it accumulated. Also, along with this, massive floods through the wadis. This was an enormous area covered in ice in the desert. So you have to think about that. 90 degrees Fahrenheit, and you're seeing this much ice cover. Something strange.